Well, folks, thanks for joining us today. I'm happy to join Kevin, and thanks, Joe, for jumping on for our Chamber Smarts and Cents. Today, we're going to be talking about what it means to volunteer with a board and some of the procedures that you would follow to not only run a meeting, make motions, understand the abridged version of Robert's rules, and talk about how we formulate policy in an organized fashion that does a good job of representing not only the membership that you're working for, if it's a member organization or whatever organization that it is, and how to work with folks so that everybody's voice is heard within that board of directors and community. So I'll just tell a real quick story about myself and how I ended up here in front of you, because it's actually a kind of funny story. It does begin in real estate, Leslie. I began working selling real estate in Chittenden County, Vermont. I actually jumped into the real estate business when I was about 17 years old, and worked my way through being a sales agent. I was with Century 21 for a long period of time, became a sales manager. I was a sales manager at a Keller Williams brand as well at Century 21. And I was a young contrarian, okay? People that know me know that I speak my beliefs and I speak my truths, and I do it the best that I can to be diplomatic as possible. And one of the things as a realtor that I was dealing with on a fairly regular basis were you had two different governing bodies, right? You had the commission, the real estate commission, which is it's an appointed board by the governor that makes and creates all the real estate rules that the realtors must follow, such as disclosure rules and such, things like that. But there's also another governing body that the realtors work with, which is the Association of Realtors, and there's several iterations. Leslie mentioned she's with the Green Mountain Board of Realtors, which is the Central Vermont version, but there's I believe there's still 9 other local boards across the state, and then there is a statewide realtor board. So my story begins as a young, I was, I believe, 23 when I got my real estate license, and as a young 23-year-old, I didn't know much about the world at the time. And I was, every time something happened or I bumped into a rule or a procedure that I had questions about, I was picking up the phone and I would call the executive director. It was Kathy Sweeten at the time at the Northwestern Vermont Board of Realtors. And I would say, Kathy, I don't like this. This is bothering me. Can we change this? What's the purpose of this? I don't understand this. Why are we doing this? And this went on for about 6 months. And I was a regular call in at the Board of Realtors. And eventually Kathy said, Matt, you seem really interested in all of this stuff. You've got all these questions. You've got some great insights. Why don't you come and join one of our committees? And for her, it was the easiest way to get me off the phone, was to bring me in, get me involved, learn a little bit about the industry, learn a little bit about the trade association and why they did the things that they did. And so I continued to volunteer on the public policy committee for them, and I enjoyed it. Politics is something that comes easily for me. It's something that I enjoy, although some people may think it's not an exciting topic, or that I should have my head checked for doing it, but I enjoy it. It's fun. I enjoy seeing people come together and debate ideas and come up with solutions for our communities. And so I did that for a long time, several years as a committee member. And then eventually I was offered, I became the chair of that committee. And then eventually I became a board director, at which point I worked my way up through the board, and eventually was, I believe in the next year or so, I was going to become the local board president. But at the same time as all that was happening, they actually lost an employee at the statewide office who does government affairs work. And I got another phone call from Kathy. You like doing this politics stuff. You're kind of the only person that we know of that really enjoys this and has a passion for it. Why don't you go down and talk to, I can't remember who the executive director was at the time, but I ended up accepting a job with the statewide Vermont Association of Realtors as their government affairs director. And that plunged me into, again, another large committee, organizing a government affairs committee. And it sent me to work up at the State House, where I was deeply exposed to committee work, as well as working with larger groups like the House floor or the Senate floor, and watching how those things operate. It's quite amazing to see in person one person that's a Speaker of the House direct 150 people in an organized fashion that they're able to walk out the door having completed the works of the day, and they're formulating the policies that we live with every single day. I very much enjoyed that. And eventually I was offered a job. While I was working with the realtors, I joined the Central Vermont Chamber and the Public Policy Committee alongside Joe and several other folks at the time. Became the board member at the Central Vermont Chamber, joined the Associated General Contractors, and now here I am as the chair. And what I've realized that is the most important thing that I can do while I'm here as the chair of this Chamber of Commerce is that I need to find my replacement. That's the most important thing that I have to work on this year. And that's why we've decided to create this course to come in and learn a little bit about what it's like to be on a board, learn the rules and procedures of how to work with things and be successful in doing so. In the hopes that one or more of you on this call that maybe isn't involved with the Central Vermont Chamber may consider joining us on a committee and participating with some of the work that we do to promote the interests of the community and businesses here in Central Vermont. So that's my story, and that's how I got here. I got involved with this politics and boards because it's a hobby, it's a passion, it's something that I very much enjoy. And I only hope that I can share that with you today and that you have a similar experience or what you learned today is going to help you on a board that you're already working on. So I'm going to flip over into a PowerPoint that I put together just to help me stay organized with my topic here. And we'll move through it. So I won't be able to, just so you know, I'll be looking at the PowerPoint. I won't see any hands raised or anything like that. But if someone has a question and wants to interrupt, I won't be offended if you interrupt me. Or you can press the button to raise your hand. And Kevin, if you would keep an eye out for those, I will take questions if any come up. So getting involved with a service organization or a chamber or something like that. So just before I get going, I need to give a general disclaimer. So the author of this PowerPoint, myself, and any of the presenters today, we're not legal representatives and we're not making any such warranties expressed or implied. This document that I'm sharing with you is a collage of some stuff that I've credited some of the sources below, but it represents an abridged version of Robert's rules that are used in smaller institutions like nonprofits and like Central Vermont Chamber of Commerce. The book for Robert's rules is several hundred pages long. If you really are interested in it, it's a good, long, boring read. And most people just follow the abridged version. So I just wanted to make that clear as we move forward. So number one, why do we volunteer? I mean, first of all, it makes other people's lives better. It improves your community, the people around you, the spaces, the places. It helps you make a direct impact and, you learn new skills. And that's something that I found was a major benefit to volunteering was, again, the volunteering, I'm not suggesting that this, volunteering with a board is just something to put on your resume and that's the only reason why you do it. There needs to be more reasons for you to be on a board or a commission. But you learn new skills that are going to help you out. You learn how executive committees meet and operate, and that's valuable. It brings leadership skills back to your place of employment. It helps you grow. You're able to develop new relationships. For me, being involved with the Central Vermont Chamber was huge. As I grew up in Chittenden County, Vermont, I moved to Central Vermont to work here in Montpelier, and I didn't know anybody. And this has helped me meet a lot of new people that I would have never met before had I not been involved. Helps you be active in the community. It reduces stress. Although sometimes meetings can be a little stressful, it reduces the stress away from the meetings because you can come in and make that impact. You're not, young Matt Musgrave, calling my executive director, questioning her on a daily basis about policy that had been created by the board. I'm actually participating with that and I'm able to make a difference. Like I said, it's good for your career. It boosts your mental health. It keeps you active and it gives you a sense of purpose. And I think in today's world, when we've all been separated by COVID and we are dealing with all these different challenges that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, it gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of belonging. And, I've developed some very good relationships that I cherish through my volunteer efforts that I've taken place in the years. So just want to give you some examples of what time estimates are, and I'm going to explain what each one of these positions do as we go forward. But the time investments, I'm looking at the Central Vermont Chamber's time investment estimates. But if you're a committee member, it's an hour or two a month. You know, the committee meetings are generally 1 hour. You might do some research outside of the meeting, but that, you know, your committees are meeting once a month. Here at AGC, we have quarterly meetings for most of our committees, with the exception of our Public Policy Committee, which meets every 2 weeks during the legislative session, but none of the meetings are longer than an hour. For directors on the board, it's generally going to be 2 to 3 hours per month because, and these are aggregated numbers, meaning when I say 2 to 3 hours for a director, that includes their time sitting on the board of directors, as well as the time that they participate on a committee that they're involved with. If you're a committee chair, you're going to add another hour because you've got to work with Kevin, you've got to work with your committee to develop an agenda and chart the course of action that your committee is going to take. The executive committee, which I'll explain what that is. It's the officers of directors. That's 3 to 5 hours per month because you're adding another meeting for the executive committee in. And then if you're the chamber chair or the president, well, in this chamber, the president's a full-time employee. I'm the chair. It's about 5, maybe a little bit more than 5 hours a month. I think Kevin would agree. I tend to spend a little more time than that, but it's because I enjoy doing this stuff and I like being involved. So let's talk about your formation of your organization and what that is and what that means. So we have some different governing documents that are required in order to create your organization. So number one, you have articles of incorporation. This is a legal document that's filed with the Secretary of State. Process is called incorporation. In some states, it has different names like a certificate of corporation or a corporate charter. So that's how basically your group, your board is raising their hand and saying, we are an organized organization. We are going to move forward. And in our case, we're the Central Vermont Chamber. So the next thing you need to do is bylaws. And at the Central Vermont Chamber, we updated our bylaws and voted on them at the annual meeting here in January. That's something that needs to be addressed and looked at once every several years, particularly if things change. Things do change quite frequently. Language changes, different requirements of the organizations change, but this is your main governing document of the organization. And in our bylaws, we spell out things like, you know, that what the committee structure should be, what the time frame of a director on the board should be, how a president should operate with their board and their executive staff. It also outlines what the committees and other task force are authorized to do in terms of policy. So your bylaws are essentially the laws of the group, and it's your main governing document that we're going to go back to on a fairly regular basis. And your knowledge of the bylaws of your association or organization are absolutely critical in a meeting, because when things come up in a meeting that sometimes fly in the face of those bylaws, if you don't know what those are, you might not be able to cite those. And we had some great individuals on our board of directors that are able to go back and they remember bylaws like the back of their hand. And that's a very powerful tool when the debate comes, that if it's not something that's supported by your bylaws, you can defeat that very easily. So the next thing, so bylaws tell us what our rules are. We also need to know what direction we're going. And in the Central Vermont Chamber of Commerce, we're a business organization, a community organization. We have a strategic plan that we're looking to potentially update this year. We developed our strategic plan about 3 years ago and voted it out, if I remember correctly. But this is a formal process that the organization gets together to create a list of their goals and objectives. So you know, for example, I think we made a significant change at the Chamber's Public Policy Committee. In our prior strategic plan, we were very involved. In fact, our executive director or CEO president would spend a lot of time up at the State House doing direct lobbying efforts for the organization. When we rewrote the strategic plan 3 years ago, we decided that we weren't going to have that big of an impact. We weren't going to have a full-time lobbying presence in the State House, although we would stay abreast of all the issues that were coming up. And if something rose to the level that the board of directors chose to move forward with, we would do lobbying efforts at that point. But as an example, we just made that sort of a minor change to that policy and how we move forward. The strategic plan, and there are different debates on how that works. My opinion of a strategic plan is that you really want to give a 30,000-foot view to what the objectives are for your organization, because this document is really the working document that your staff and your board will follow to complete those projects or jobs, works, goals. Meaning, if you make them too strict or too stringent, you sometimes can tie the hands and make not only tie the hands of the staff that are working for you, but you can also complicate the job for the staff and take away their ability to be creative or be resourceful using the skills that you specifically hired them for. So that's why a lot of folks, myself included, believe your strategic plan should be a 30,000-foot view, point the direction that we're going in, and that we then as a board and as a staff create we get into the weeds in the board meetings and our committee meetings. Some people disagree with me. Some people believe that a strategic plan should include a lot of specific measurable results, such as a good example would be we might put in a strategic plan. Don't worry, Kevin, we're not going to do it, although this is a great idea, that you would go add 400 new members to the Central Vermont Chamber of Commerce by December 1st of 2022. We're not going to do that. I don't believe that at this board, I don't believe that would make us successful, although there are some arguments that other folks may have that for maybe different types of organizations that follow a little bit more formal process or a little bit more of a legal process, such as a government body. So the next and last document that I'm going to talk about today is your policies and procedure manuals. So these are your policy and procedures that will be followed by the staff. And generally the policy and procedures manual is generated by the executive director or CEO, at which point they would present that to the board of directors, who would codify it as a rule that they can go back to. And these policies and procedures involve anything from equal opportunity, anti-discrimination, disciplinary procedures, how people take overtime, how the weekend pay works, and any other policies. I mean, one that I didn't include here that's a huge one now is social media, because now companies are looking at how their employees are using social media, and a fairly normal policy is that an employee wouldn't use their personal social media platforms to do anything that would degrade the organization. And I'm sure that our staff would never do that at Central Vermont Chamber. But that's your policies and procedure manual. It's the rules for your staff and what their policies are and how they're supposed to act. So I just want to give you a basic outline of the structure of a board. This doesn't accurately represent the Central Vermont Chamber. Ours is a little bit different, but basically the way that a general board structure works is it starts at the top where you have a chair or a president. The next level down, and we do it a little bit different at the Central Vermont Chamber. We have the chair, then we have the executive committee, which is comprised of vice chairs. So we have, I believe, 4 or 5 vice chairs who are the chairs of the committees, rather than having an independent vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. So that's a little bit different on ours, but the top part there is what you would consider to be the officers of your organization: the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. When we do our corporate filings, we actually indicate to the Secretary of State who holds those positions, because they are fiduciary positions that are required for reporting. Then the other difference that we have is the executive director or the CEO. So Kevin Eschelbach is the president of the Central Vermont Chamber, and unlike an executive director who has no power or no vote or authority on the board, our president at Central Vermont Chamber is a vested voting member. So he would be up in the officers section. Essentially, I would say it would be parallel to where the chair was in terms of a board meeting. So then we have our different committees, and fairly common committees are governance, finance, executive, fundraising, and marketing. So in each one of these committees has a role that they have to do, and we'll talk about that role now. So the board of directors are the fiduciaries who steer the organization and create the policies that the organization will follow. So it's a democratic society that creates policy, vets policy to a certain degree, and then votes those policies out, which generally directs the staff to do different jobs, tasks, or programs. So within the executive committee, or within the board of directors, you have the executive committee. And as I said, the Central Vermont Executive Committee is comprised of the chairs of our task committees. So we have 4 or 5 executive committee meeting members that assemble, and I'll explain what they do in briefly when we get to talking about how the meetings are run and operated. But they have, in general nature, executive committees have the ability to act as a liaison for the board. They can make decisions on the board depending on what the bylaws say. Central Vermont Chamber of Commerce's bylaws do not allow for the executive committee to take action for the board unless there is an emergency or other mitigating reason. But in what Central Vermont Chamber's board does is generally make sure everything's all set for the larger board of directors meeting, so that there's no surprises, that we're able to go through the meeting and have a relatively informed meeting prior to moving forward. So task committees are very important. And in order for the board of directors to be successful, we have to have policies that are absolutely vetted, research done, evidence found, and recommendations for the board. The reason is, a task committee is formed. It's a group of people that have special skills and abilities that they want to use to help craft policy or proposals to move forward with. So, and it's important that they do that job and they present a finished product to the board of directors, because at the board of directors meeting, you generally would have 1.5 hours to 2 hours to complete a full agenda. And if you get to a piece where you have a policy that hasn't been fully well vetted by the committees, they should be able to answer questions and put any of the questions that the board has to ease, because they'd already done the research and figured out what the best course of action would be for the board. Doesn't always mean that the board of directors is going to agree with what the policy recommendations are of a task committee, but in general they do, because that's where the work is done. And you have to have a level of trust in the group that you're working with, that they are working in the best interest of the association, because in fact they are fiduciaries of the organization and require a duty for its members. The last piece that we have is a task force, which are generally very rare in creation. But unlike a committee is a constantly running piece of your organization. So, like I said, it depends on what your committee schedule is. At the Central Vermont Chamber, our committees meet on a monthly basis, and they present the report to the executive committee, who compiles the report, at which point the board of directors then get to view that report at the board meeting and in documents that are sent out prior to said meeting. The task force is a little bit different. A task force is something that you would create if you were in the middle. And a good example of a creation of a task force is if you have some new business that's brought up that has a time-sensitive element to it. So in a board meeting, you at the end would generally ask if there's any new business. And I'll pick on again Central Vermont Chamber. We realized last year that we needed to put together a committee or a task force to address some repairs to the building. I called it a task force. We sometimes call it a committee, but in my opinion, it was really a task force that we assembled because it was a finite project. We needed to come in, we needed to meet with some builders, we needed to meet with the finance committee to see if we could do the things that we needed to do, present to the board, and then that task force can disband. And oftentimes when a president or a chair will appoint a task force, they'll give them not only a very specific pointed mission, but they'll also put a time frame on it so that it doesn't go on and work into perpetuity forever. All right. That was a lot of talking. Before I go any farther, does anybody have any questions? Well, with none, I'll move forward. So meeting procedure. So, and this is going to depend, it's going to be different depending on the meetings that you go to, but this is going to be a general procedure that's followed at most meetings. So the meetings are generally run by the chair or the president of the board, at which point the president or the chair, once everybody got to the meeting, and generally it's good to be on time for meetings, the chair will call the meeting to order, announce the time that they went to order, and the secretary or staff member would begin taking notes and recording minutes for the remainder of the meeting. So the second order of the day would generally be a review and approval of the prior meeting minutes. Now, I'll give you just a couple of pieces on minutes before I move forward. So the minutes or meeting notes, whatever you want to call them, just like your strategic plan, there's different schools of thought of what they should look like. Now, coming from a public policy background where we're generally talking about people like legislators and stuff like that, politicians and such, where some of those conversations are maybe a little more private, that, nothing bad, but just, anecdotal conversations about how policy is crafted, I generally don't think those are worthy of being put into notes or into minutes. What I do think is important is that you're recording the topics of the day that you're talking about within those meetings. So, for example, if it was a meeting of the events committee, they would talk about, your meeting minutes may say there was a discussion held related to the music that would be had at the annual meeting. The next topic was we talked about our summer mixer outside and what type of burgers and dogs we were going to bring. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to go into conversation about, well, we decided we were going to go to Shaw's and pick up the beef only hot dogs. It just literally needs to be, we organized our picnic and we're going to have a grill and burgers and dogs. So I think that's important. The other thing that's important is if there's any kind of a motion or action taken by the committee, that is also very important, not only to record the action, but who made the motions, the first and the second of the motion, if there was any discussion, what those topics were, and then the final vote. In a small informal committee or in a chamber of commerce like we have, you're generally not doing a roll call vote. The votes would be done simply by, a majority action. And if there was ever a question of how that vote went, you would divide the room and count the votes, but you wouldn't generally do a roll call. However, in the state legislature or in other large governing bodies, particularly political organizations, you will see a roll call vote where they read names and ask for a vote to be announced out loud. And that's often done with political purposes behind it. So once you read and approve the minutes, a motion would be made to approve the minutes. If any discussion were to be had, generally, there are people that, some have very high levels of attention to detail and some people don't, but you'll generally have an edit or two that's made. That edit or two would become voted on. I just mentioned what my opinion of notes should be. Some people believe that notes should be very, very detailed, and I would make the argument if you were, for example, crafting law, or you were working with health, or something else that needed to absolutely dot every I and cross every T, that would certainly make sense. But in a small volunteer nonprofit, where lives aren't at stake, it generally isn't necessary to have every remark recorded. So the next thing that generally will happen is the chair or the president, depending on what your organization calls them, will deliver some opening remarks. They'll give the report because that's their opportunity to try to steer the direction of the meeting and move things forward. At that point, we would move on to the orders of the day. And for the Central Vermont Chamber, that's committee reports. For other groups, it may be the orders of the day and a topical agenda that you would have to follow. At the Central Vermont Chamber, we have committee reports. Some of them are informational. For example, the reports on membership are generally informational, although there's a vote to approve, so that makes that actionable. The events committee is generally informational because that's a report of what's coming up. We've already vetted this. We've got our hot dog and hamburger formal set up for this summer. Everything's moving forward. If you have any questions, now's the time to ask. On the actionable side, we talk about, reviewing our budget. So when our finance committee presents the year-to-date budget information, the profit and loss statements, as well as our balance sheets, it's important because as a board of directors, we owe a fiduciary duty to our membership. And that means that on a monthly basis, you really need to take not a deep dive like an audit, but you really need to look at all of the different columns. And I have personal experience witnessing that fall apart at an organization I work for. And it doesn't look good because the challenge that occurs in finance is that you have attrition through your board. So you'll have people that come and go. And if you have enough people that go out of your board, you lose institutional information. So people don't remember where I spent that, $20,000. Where did that $20,000 go? Why did we spend that? If people can't answer those questions, it creates a lot of confusion. And that's why it's important that you continually go over the financials on a regular basis so that people that are staying on the board can share that institutional information where people come from. And that's an actionable item, meaning you would pass a motion to approve the financials as presented by the committee. There'd be a second discussion if there were any numbers that people had confusion with, and then there'd be a vote to approve. So I'm looking at my clock here, it's 2:44. I'm going to start talking a little bit faster so we have time for questions, but I'm not in a rush to leave. I can stay afterwards. And just quick housekeeping, Kevin will be distributing this PowerPoint to everybody who's attended this session so that you don't need to take notes. I guess I could have told you that about 30 minutes ago. So the next thing on our meeting procedure is would be old business. So that would be a topic that was brought up before, that maybe a committee or a task force had found some information. Something that would go outside of a normal committee report. It was an action or a proposal that took place at the full board on a prior meeting. You'd handle your old business. And then the last thing, I didn't put adjourn on here, but the last thing that you would do before adjournment is you would ask if there's any new business that's occurring that people need to talk about. Generally, it's not well received if by the chair, if someone shows up with some new business that's controversial at the very end of a 2-hour meeting. So my advice is if you're ever to bring new business to a meeting, I would highly recommend at least having a conversation with the chair prior to the executive committee meeting so that they can prepare so that the discussion can be had and appropriate time can be allotted to that new business item, although that's not a requirement. So I just went through a general meeting agenda, but there's also another type of agenda that's called a consent agenda. And a consent agenda is an agenda that allows the board to approve all of the items on their agenda without discussion or individual motion. So I'll explain to you how our executive committee works and how it used to work. So our executive committee, let me see if I can go back a slide. So our executive committee used to go through this general meeting procedure. We would have a call to order. We would review minutes. We would have an opening remarks. We'd have our full committee reports. We would talk about the financials, go through old business and new business, and that would take approximately an hour and a half. And at which point, the very next week, we'd have the full board meeting, and we would bring this exact same meeting procedure to the full board and have another hour and a half to 2-hour meeting with the full board, essentially repeating the exact same content. So when I became chair, I believe that, I respect everybody's time, and I want to allow the not only time for you to do things that you would normally do in your day-to-day or business life, but also more time that you can volunteer to do things like recruit new members or recruit other members to join the committees. So what we've done is instituted a consent agenda for our executive committee meetings. And we went from an hour and a half to 13 minutes last week. So the way that a consent agenda works is you send out, so you basically hold all of your committee meetings prior to the executive committee meeting. Your committee chairs, who again on the Central Vermont Chamber or all the executive committee, would put together a written report. The membership committee would list the new members that would come in. Finance puts out their finance report. Public policy puts out a report on their meeting, and events puts out their report as to what's coming up. If there's nothing that's highly controversial within those pieces, the way that the consent agenda works is you're expected to read all those documents ahead of time before you come to the meeting. You come to the consent agenda meeting, you would call the meeting to order. Generally, the president or chair would give a brief talk or discussion, and then they would move to pass the consent agenda as presented. And there would be a motion made on the floor, a second, and then there wouldn't be discussion. It goes right to a full vote. The reason why there wouldn't be discussion is that in the consent agenda, if there was an item for discussion, it should be called prior to trying to move the consent agenda. Meaning, if, for example, there was a financial issue that occurred, and we were $5,000 below or above budget, and we needed to have that conversation, what we would do is you would notify the chair prior to the executive committee meeting that we need to pull the financials out of the consent agenda and make it its own agenda item. So you would still do your consent agenda for all of the other committee reports that would get that done quickly for things that are not controversial. And then it would allow as much time as you need to talk about the financials and vote to approve or to amend those financial statements to move forward. So it's really set up that, it's to maximize the use of the time, get things that are just boilerplate conversations, like these are the 5 new members we have. If they're 5 non-controversial members, there's really no reason to have a long conversation about it. Let's move it out and get it going. But if there is a concern, anyone on the committee has the opportunity prior to or at the beginning of a consent agenda meeting to ask for an agenda item to be pulled out, and it'll be given its full day in court, so to speak, as it should be, because it's a controversial or challenging thing that you need to be prepared to discuss in detail at the board of directors meeting. That's a consent agenda. It's not one that you generally will see out there. It's hard to accomplish. It really works well with very small boards or very organized boards. One board, if you're interested in looking, the City of Burlington Council, the City Council of Burlington is a pretty amazing organization to watch. They are very organized. A lot of those folks, I believe, have, they have public policy majors of some sort, and they really go through it. They follow a consent agenda, and they're very strict. And what they do is follow a very strict code of Robert's rules, which I'm going to explain to you now. So Robert Rules of Order are basically, it's a guiding principle that creates a system that large groups of people can meet, and that everyone is able to participate, that everybody has a right to know what's going on at all times, that people can be organized in their discussions, that there isn't crosstalk or chatter or filibustering or over talking, and a lot of the Robert's Rules of Order are based on a motion. And a motion is the topic under discussion. A motion is the initiation of a proposal of policy. So in my example here, I move that we add a coffee break to this meeting. Well, I don't drink coffee, I drink Diet Pepsi, so I'll have a sip of Diet Pepsi. So any member can introduce a motion when no other motion is on the table during a board meeting. So what would happen is, in the Zoom world, we'd press the raise the hand button, or in a general meeting, you would either address the chair by raising your hand, or you'd say, Mr. Chair, or the chairman, or Madam Chair, to address the chair, at which point they would recognize you, and you have the opportunity to make a motion. You can make that motion at pretty much any time that it's appropriate. If it's not appropriate, someone will call you out with another motion or order that would knock you off that then the chair would consider if you were out of order making that motion. Generally, you have a lot of motions that are made while people are discussing a topic. So if there is a debate on the finances, for example, you might make a motion that we table approval of the financials until such and such document can be produced to the full board. And we have a fiduciary duty. So if you're not absolutely clear about what's in the budget or the financials, that's an absolutely appropriate motion to make, a motion to get more information. And what I've done here, and I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but I went ahead and put a list together with some help from some of the organizations I cited at the beginning of this, just some different orders that you can make and different motions that you can make. You want more study or investigation about a motion. That would be generally you're going to refer it to a committee or a task force, because the committees and task forces are the ones that do the heavy lifting and do the studying and vetting. You want more time to discuss, so you might postpone a decision. You haven't heard enough, or you've heard enough. And moving forward, you have all these different pieces. You want to take a break. You want to end the meeting. You move to adjourn. You're unsure of the president of the board announced the vote of the House, the vote correctly. You will generally see this in politics a lot, like on our state house, the House of Representatives floor. You have 150 people that are voting at any time by voice. And what will happen is if there is a large vote and it's on a controversial issue and it's it's close to a 50-50 vote, what you'll hear is everybody will do their ayes and nays. And then if someone's not convinced that the president or the speaker in this case made the right decision, they would call for a division of the House, which in the state House scenario, they actually literally go to different sides of the room, at which point they are counted. If you're confused about a procedure, you're going to ask about a point of information or a point of parliamentary inquiry. These types of points are used and can be used strategically to staunch or bury an argument. That's something that's important. That's why understanding the Roberts rules is critical if you're going to, and you don't need to know the whole book, but within this PowerPoint, you're getting enough to be dangerous at a meeting. You want to change action that was voted on earlier in the meeting. You can move to rescind. The other thing a chair can do is ask for unanimous consent if it's considered to be a minor or there's no opposition expected for a motion or a proposal. There's only a couple of reasons you can interrupt the speaker, and there's reasons for this. I mentioned earlier the reason why we have Robert's Rules of Order is that everybody has a right in that meeting to hear everything that's going on. Everybody has a right in that meeting to have input in what's going on, and everybody has a right to be treated fairly. And that's why these rules exist. So you can interrupt people to get information through a parliamentary inquiry. You can have a question of privilege if you can't hear something, or there's other personal issues that you may have. You can make a point of order. The point of order is the one that generally you will see people, a good example of it, 2:55, folks. I'm just about done and ready for questions. The point of order is one I hear used a lot on the state house floors, whether it's the Senate or the House of Representatives, in that in general, and it's used a lot when, someone is interrogating the presenter of a bill or a motion and they start going off topic. You'll generally hear someone will stand up and make a point of order, and they might say, well, Matt Musgrave's discussion topic's not germane to this issue, so I'm not sure it's appropriate for this conversation. At which point the chair of the board would make the decision whether it's germane to the conversation. And if it's not germane, then they would ask the presenter or the interrogator of the presenter that it would not be appropriate to continue that line of questioning. You can disagree with the president or of the board's ruling and appeal that. And you can also disagree with a call for unanimous consent, which would force it into a normal debate and motion for approval. So last but not least, I went ahead and I made a quick reference guide for you on some of the most common references, most common motions that you're going to see out there. Main motion, to amend a motion, to kill a motion, limit debate, recess, and you can see what different things must happen during these. So, one that we often like to talk about here at the Central Vermont Chamber. It's an inside joke that we all share, is that motion to adjourn. So we would, ask for our motion to adjourn, and we would get our first, and we would get a second, and then, we always add, motion to adjourn is not open for discussion. So all in favor, and it's kind of an inside thing that we have fun with at the Central Vermont Chamber. So I think I've given you enough tools over the last 45 minutes to be dangerous at a board meeting. These are not the full board, full Robert's Rules of Order. People do it differently. I think Alicia mentioned having come from out of state. She's maybe seeing some things that Vermonters do that are different than folks out of state, and I believe that's normal. And you may also volunteer on boards and commissions. I mean, I look at the differences that exist between the Central Vermont Chamber and the board that I run here at AGC. We do things very differently. At AGC, the Executive Committee Board meets 8 times a year, and the full board only meets 4 times a year. And the Executive Committee has the full power and authority of the full board. Whereas that's not the same at the Central Vermont Chamber. The Executive Committee really only helps, and I say only, the Executive Committee helps prepare for the meeting so that we have an organized meeting of the board members and use their time wisely, use it effectively, and make sure that everybody's heard. So folks, that's what I've got for today. I really appreciate you coming along and listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and also any other discussion that you may have.